Everyone, and welcome to a special edition of the Astroinsights blog. So here in the UK we are about to elect a new Prime Minister, and this happens via an in-house election within the members of the Tory or the Conservative Party. So all the votes have now been sent in by members, and counting will continue until the 5th of September. So next week they will make the announcement as to who is likely to be the next Prime Minister. So I thought it would be an interesting time while we're kind of waiting for the results to have a look at both the human design and the astrology charts of both candidates, because I think it gives us a lot more information than we're getting sort of straight from media interviews and that kind of thing. I think the human design is particularly telling, and so I hope you'll enjoy it, and let's see what we can see. First up, we've got Liz Truss. Now, she is the current favourite to win the Tory leadership race. So this is her kind of manifesto in a nutshell: trusted to deliver, ready to lead. And she says she's the candidate with a clear vision based on shared conservative principles of low tax, freedom and sound economic management. And she's talking about growing the economy, levelling up across the United Kingdom and fighting for freedom at home and across the world. So really appealing to the sort of Western liberal values, a little bit kind of leaning to the right, and also, you know, those kind of traditional Tory values of low tax and sort of sound economic management. But, you know, again, a little bit vague in terms of what that involves. You know, she's not being sort of big on detail. But nonetheless, we get a sense that she's got more experience, certainly, than Rishi Sunak in terms of actually holding positions in government. She's held several kind of senior posts, you know, including being foreign minister under Boris Johnson. So it'll be interesting to see, you know, how that kind of plays out. So she's really kind of talking about delivering and about leading. So again, very, very interesting when we come to look at her human design. But if we just look at her chart, it's really, really interesting. So Dominic Cummings gave her this nickname, the human hand grenade. And at the time, obviously, he was a little bit sort of bit and twisted after having ousted from Downing Street. But nonetheless, I think it's quite an interesting moniker given certain things in her chart. So, you know, particularly Uranus and the position of Uranus. But let's kind of start kind of from the beginning. And, you know, the first thing that I'm always interested in when I look at a candidate's profile is what they look like, because very often that will tell me, it will give me clues as to what their rising sign is likely to be, because, you know, in both instances we don't actually have time of birth for either candidate, so we're having to guess house positions. And for me, house positions are extremely important because they really do tell you where planets are likely to kind of turn up in terms of their energy. They aren't necessarily general in terms of how they work. They tend to be quite specific depending on where they are placed or located in the chart. So with Liz, I have kind of gone for a birth time of around 4 in the morning. And the reason for that is that it gives Cancer rising. And to me, Liz has got a lot of like facial features that point to somebody who's got strong kind of Cancerian features. She's also at the same time a Sun Leo, and I do think you can see it in her colouring and in sort of in the way that her face is arranged. And I think it's kind of interesting that she really seems to have kind of come into her Leo energy in sort of during this particular leadership campaign. I mean, certainly if you look at earlier videos of her when she was in politics, you know, quite a long time ago, she seemed quite sort of fresh-faced and much more Cancerian. So I think it's interesting, you know, how she's kind of progressed. And yes, so that's kind of my best guess, is that she's got Cancer rising with Leo also in her first house. So the Sun in Leo in her first house. So there's that blend of kind of Leo Cancer energy. And interestingly, you know, if you've got Cancer rising, then the moon is your ruling planet. And in this case, you know, Liz has the moon in Pisces. And this is quite an interesting combination, as we'll see when we look at her chart in relation to that of the Tory party, because they also have that chart also has moon in Pisces. So in a sense, this is quite soft energy. The moon in Pisces tends to be very sensitive, you know, wants to kind of serve, tends to be quite selfless, and can sometimes not have good emotional boundaries. And And as I say, I think the character that we see now in comparison to her earlier days in politics, I think she's probably had to toughen up quite a lot, especially, since MPs have become a lot more public facing in terms of having social media profiles, email addresses, that kind of thing. And, a lot of politicians have, particularly women, have resigned or kind of expressed the view that being a politician these days, particularly since the murder of Joe, what was her surname? I can't remember her surname now, but the Labour politician who was murdered by the fanatic, that a lot of politicians, particularly women, feel, that they have to swallow a lot of abuse from people. And I mean, some of the political cartoons that I've seen in recent months have been vicious, to say the least. So I kind of think that if she does have the moon in Pisces, and she is quite sensitive, that she's probably had to sort of toughen up quite a lot, as I say, during the course of her political career. And particularly, if you are a woman in a man's world, much like Margaret Thatcher discovered, you do have to be quite sort of formidable. And I think in that sense, a lot of people have talked about her trying to emulate Margaret Thatcher, and in terms of that kind of Iron Lady facade. But I do think that it sort of hides a much softer, much more caring individual, but possibly also an individual that is not, doesn't always have the best boundaries. So she may be one of those people that has to have gatekeepers, helpers or sort of personal assistants who kind of keep others out so that she can sort of do what she needs to do. And it's also interesting that the moon is sitting in the ninth house, if this is indeed the correct time of birth for her, because this points to her sense of conviction, and it also points to her kind of attitude, or the way that she works when it comes to lawmaking, philosophy, her kind of her politics, if you like. And the moon tends to be changeable. It can be a little bit driven by kind of going with the flow, or with what the sort of the general mood of the populace or the day is. And there is that danger always, especially given that she's got a square to natal Neptune in the 6th house. And in fact, she's got a T-square with Venus in Virgo, and then Neptune in Sagittarius. So it could well be, as I say, that she started out quite like a little bit idealistic and maybe a bit naive when she went into politics, and then soon realized that she had to really sort of toughen up and try to sort of get a little bit more I mean, she's often accused of not being very details oriented, and if that is true, then this is probably why, because this is a mutable T-square. You've got Neptune in Sagittarius in the 6th house of work, which is a little bit nebulous, and it does tend to sort of like overflow boundaries and needs structuring. And then you've got this, as I say, this moon in the 9th house, which is opposing Venus and Virgo. Now, Venus and Virgo likes structure, it likes to be precise and specific, and I think you can see this when she speaks, that she's got quite a sort of a short, sharp way of speaking. Again, not the way that she sort of started out. She started out, I think, with quite a strong lisp, and seemed, as I say, very approachable and friendly, and as I say, quite sort of naive. And I think, as I say, over time she's had to sort of like modify that image so that she's come more into the energy of Saturn and Mercury. She's got a Saturn-Mercury conjunction in Cancer in the 1st house, and this can also hide someone's maternal energy. It can hide their warmth, it can hide their sort of personal charisma to an extent, and people do complain that she comes across as a little bit cold, but I think that, like, the giveaway for me was, or the tell was, during that interview where the presenter fainted, and you could kind of see on her face that she was sort of mortified and sort of like ran to help the presenter. And I think that's more true to her character. I think that this sort of Iron Lady facade is just that. It's a little bit of a facade, like a bit of a tough exterior. But there's a lot of water in her chart. If you look at the element kind of breakdown, we see that she's got more water than anything else. It's water and then fire, followed by earth and then air. But she's also got a lot of cardinal energy, so that's kind of interesting. Cardinal water, it's not always necessarily, leading in terms of policy. It can be leading in terms of setting a mood or a tone, and that may be, the way that that's going to be maybe signature of her kind of leadership style if she does win, that you will kind of get more of a sense of her mood, and that will really dictate kind of how things sort of go. So that's kind of interesting. She also has a T-square with Jupiter and Uranus and Saturn. So you can see Uranus down here in Libra in her 5th house, and then we've got Jupiter right next to Chiron in Aries. And it's interesting that that her Jupiter's in Aries, because Jupiter is currently in the sign of Aries. It ingressed into Aries in, I think, April or May. And although it's due to retrograde back into Pisces over sort of November, December, it will return to Aries, and next year she will have a Jupiter return, and that's always a really lucky time for anyone, particularly when it comes to popularity and that type of thing. And if you consider that if she does have Jupiter in her 11th house, and then this could point to an increase in popularity over time. So she may be one of those people that sort of initially people don't really connect with, because she doesn't seem to exude a lot of personal warmth with that Saturn-Mercury conjunction. But perhaps over time, people do see through the exterior, and maybe she starts to relax a little bit, and then we start to see more of her natural sort of warmth. But the problem is that Jupiter is opposing Uranus, and this is where this human hand grenade kind of comes in, that she's often sent in, like a lot of women politicians, I have to say. If you think about Theresa May in the position of Home Secretary, if you think about Priti Patel being put into the role of Home Secretary, these women always have to sort of play these kind of attack dog, quite sort of strong or strict kind of almost teacher or kind of disciplinarian type of kind of caricatures, where they're having to sort of enforce rules and be quite sort of formidable. And it may not necessarily be a true reflection of their particular beliefs or their character. It just comes with the role. The nature of the role of Home Secretary, I think, is to be quite a sort of a tough guy, if you like, a foil to the Prime Minister, who's usually then seen as a bit more human and approachable. So it's interesting. And Uranus there can sometimes be a little bit unpredictable. So, for instance, I think it's, most people don't necessarily know this, but her political career kind of came to a bit of a sticking point in the 1990s, I think, because she had an affair with a colleague and a fellow MP, and this did impede her career for some time. It didn't break up her marriage, but it did break up the other person's marriage. And I think she had to kind of take a step back from politics, and also maybe kind of get a little bit clearer about the divide between personal and private, between sort of like career and that kind of thing. And maybe that was also at that point that she decided to reorient, to kind of pivot, so that she wasn't necessarily quite so open, to everybody. Didn't let everyone in, and maybe wasn't as open about her, her personal life. But that Uranus, it can be a little bit sort of unpredictable and sort of sometimes sabotaging, but equally, I think it can help to sort of to drive reform forward. So she is very often, and she has been in the past, sent in when situations are tricky and where there's a slightly an unorthodox or sort of an irreverent approach is kind of needed in order to sort of get things done. And so I'll be interested to see how this sort of plays out, if she does become the next Tory leader, as to whether she is a little bit volatile, and that this can sometimes affect her popularity, or whether it's just that she is gaffe prone, whether she sometimes kind of inadvertently trips herself up, and that this can sort of sometimes hamper her ability to be taken seriously, with that T-square to Saturn. I mean, the other thing that I think is interesting is that Margaret Thatcher had a Jupiter-Pluto opposition, so also a Jupiter that was slightly inhibited. And, I think it's interesting that she's got Pluto in Libra, and that Pluto, it's not as impeded as Margaret Thatcher's. So she's actually got a sextile to Neptune. And I think, to an extent, she is always very well dressed and sort of exudes a sort of an air of attractiveness. And there's some, I mean, she has been mocked for this. People have said she's vain, and I don't see why a woman shouldn't take pride in her appearance. If you think about Theresa May and she always had amazing shoes, and she was, in that sense, she was a bit of a shoe. What's the word? She liked a shoe. She did follow fashion. That there's nothing wrong with taking pride in your appearance, and that there is this very subtle allure about her. And I think she probably does have to sort of tread a fine line between, this kind of strict, no-nonsense schoolmom type of kind of air, and then the slightly more subtly seductive kind of image with her dresses that always nip in her waist and show off her curves and that kind of thing. And Margaret Thatcher was the same, actually. Like, she used to flirt a lot with members of her cabinet if she wanted to sort of get something done. She was definitely known for that. So it's interesting, not afraid to use her feminine wiles when necessary. And I just think, if you think about like Machiavelli and that kind of thing, that politics is a sort of a dirty game, and women have it hard enough as it is on so many levels, that why shouldn't she use the weapons at her disposal in order to persuade? Sometimes rhetoric or sort of oratory isn't enough, and other politicians, male politicians, will use other things like they'll use their personal charisma. I mean, if you think about Rishi Sunak, which we'll come to in a minute, he's kind of informally known as Dishy Rishi. And so I don't see why a woman shouldn't also sort of use what assets she has kind of naturally. And I think that Neptune-Pluto sextile points to that. So interesting that, that Neptune is in her 6th house, that maybe when she needs to sort of get things done or she needs votes, that she may privately, because Pluto's in the 4th house, that she may privately kind of use her feminine wiles to sort of persuade and cajole, that type of thing. But it can also talk about being sort of subtly persuasive. So I'll be very interested to see, if she does win, the style of her speeches, particularly in Parliament, because I don't really see her as being somebody who's going to be sort of high-handed and sort of what's the word? Like Margaret Thatcher could be a little bit, she could be quite, like, dramatic, and, this lady is not for turning, and I don't really see Liz Truss as being quite the same. I think that she's essentially an introvert, but she is powerful, which we'll see when we come to her human design, and I don't think that she should be underestimated, from that perspective, and I think that Pluto-Neptune sextile can speak of that this is somebody who should not be kind of underestimated. She may seem on the surface to be like unimpressive, but I think people kind of underestimate her at their peril. Particularly if you look at her, like her education and her background. This is a very bright woman, and her father was a sort of a mathematics professor. I think her mother was a nurse, and she herself kind of did several degrees in sort of, I think, economics, mathematics, that type of things, and philosophy. So she's a very deep thinker, I think, with that Saturn Mercury. And as I say, I think people underestimate her at their peril. Yes, I mean, what I do also think is interesting is that that Neptune kind of is the ruler of Pisces, and it's right next to her part of fortune in the 6th house. So that kind of points to where you are likely to succeed, or the best way for you to succeed. And it does, in her case, point to a life of service, using her career or her day-to-day job as being a way to sort of to be of service, and to be of service to your ideals when we are talking about Sagittarius. So I do think that that's the reason that she went into politics. I do think that she is, to an extent, a conviction politician. It's just that she possibly hasn't had a chance to express those convictions yet. You know, a lot of people say that she doesn't seem to have a particular viewpoint, that she seems a little bit shallow. And it could just be that she doesn't necessarily want to reveal that now, because she feels that it would potentially alienate certain voters, that she would rather sort of just speak about what she can do in terms of deliver, you know, in terms of solving current problems, and kind of get into the conviction stuff later. Because of course, you know, the UK is going through quite a tumultuous time at the moment with Brexit and with the cost of living crisis and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of things that need to be sorted out first, I think, before, you know, she can really sort of hit her stride and determine what she wants to achieve in terms of a legacy, that type of thing. Here we have the chart for Liz Truss, and it's transposed onto that of the Tory party. So this is the 1912 Tory party chart, because of course the Tories originally came into being in about 1848, I think, something like that, and then sort of had a bit of a brand or whatever it was in 1912. So this is based on that particular chart, and that has Virgo rising. It's really interesting, and it's got the Sun and Saturn in a conjunction in Taurus on the midheaven. So it's quite a powerful chart, actually. And what's so interesting is how much synastry there is between Liz Truss's chart and the Tory party. So if we start, for example, with the fact that moon that I was talking about, that moon in Pisces, sits on the descendant of the Tory party chart, and it's very close to a conjunction with the Tory party moon, also in Pisces, at about 1 degree. Given that we are talking about the luminaries, we could say that moon is conjunct Chiron. I mean, it is 10 degrees, but we give a bit more leeway with the luminaries than we do with the rest of the planets. So it's a really interesting one. It's almost as though she kind of has the potential to either kind of touch on a sort of a soft spot, or a sort of like a vulnerable spot when it comes to the Tory party's weaknesses, but equally it does point potentially to the ability to sort of heal and unify different aspects of the party. And apparently, you know, she is quite popular with Tory party members. So that's really interesting. The other thing is that she's got Mars on the midheaven. Here you can see, which is conjunct that Sun-Saturn conjunction. This is very energizing, and it's very catalyzing. So it's almost as though, you know, if the Tory party has come to any sort of impasse or has maybe got a little bit stale or in a rut, this can really kind of kickstart things, so that things can kind of move in a much more positive direction. And I mean, it can also sometimes aggravate. That's the only kind of downside of Mars. But at least Mars here is in Taurus, so Mars is in Taurus. So it tends to be a lot less erratic or impulsive or overtly aggressive. Taurus often makes, because it's the next side on from Aries, it's quite a patient sign. It tends to be quite systematic in terms of how it goes about things. It's not in a rush. It likes to sort of like do tried and tested things. So it's not a sign where you're going to find Mars kind of galloping ahead and being really what's the word? Like being sort of really pushy or overly like go-getting. No, I don't want to say go-getting, but you know, just sort of being a bit of a bull in a china shop. It tends to be a little bit more sensible and cautious, shall we say. So in that sense, it can actually work quite well. And as I say, it does promise to sort of re-energize or revivify the Tory party potentially. A lot depends though on how the Mars is kind of used. And if we just go back quickly to her natal chart, we can see that she's got Mars here as part of quite a wide stellium of planets in Aries and Taurus. But it's close to her. Again, it's kind of close to her south node, but not really. It's about 10 degrees. And it's sextile, if we look down here. No, it isn't. It's actually interesting because it's unaspected. Her Mars is unaspected. So that's kind of interesting. It's almost like it's quite masculine energy, but it's somewhat isolated. It's not being given an opportunity to work because it's not making an aspect to anything. So it's not in relationship with anything else. And that could be also what people sense about Liz Truss, is that there is this dynamism, this sort of untapped power, and kind of dynamism, which somehow just isn't touching the mark, and that could also be part of the kind of mystique of who she is, and whether she's, and this doubt as to whether she can actually sort of turn out to be very effective. So going back to that chart, as I say, we do have Mars making this this conjunction to the Tory Sun Saturn conjunction, and as I say, that is very, very powerful in terms of two planets that are very much associated with the establishment, with patriarchy, but also with power in a very real sense. The Sun is about leadership. Saturn is very much about that considered energy of bringing people with you, of kind of doing the right thing, of kind of having traditional values, which is very much in alignment with Tory, what the Tory party kind of stands for. So I do think that she's being honest when she says that she wants to sort of drive home, or to sort of deliver on traditional Tory manifesto promises, that kind of thing, that she does actually mean to deliver on those. And then she's also got her Jupiter sits conjunct the Tory party Mercury. This is also an interesting one here in the 9th house. And Mercury is, of course, very close to the south, to the North Node. So this very much has to do with the sort of the overarching purpose, or kind of aim of the party. Their manifesto in many senses, what they stand for, what they think, their philosophy, because the 9th house is very much about philosophy. So it's their way of going about making laws. And as I say, it is based on quite traditional, slightly to the right, conservative values, that kind of libertarian type of Western, libertarian type of thing. So that's kind of interesting that she would, in that sense, that she does believe. She is a conviction politician in that she does actually believe in what the Tory party stands for. And that's kind of interesting because she didn't start out as being a Tory party member. She initially joined the Lib Dems, the Liberal Democrats, and switched party. So it is interesting that she seems to have kind of found her niche, and that she does actually want to make laws and to sort of rule in accordance with, as I say, traditional Tory values. Yes, I mean, what's also interesting is that her Mercury Saturn is conjunct the Tory party Mars Neptune. So if we move to the 11th house, which is generally the house of groups, where we tend to sort of where the party kind of comes together in order to sort of to get things done, or to vote on things, or that there's this element of kind of popular mandates or popularity that she's got, that's where the Sun Mercury conjunction sits. So that could be slightly problematic if people see her as being overly serious, but at the same time it certainly means that the Tory party would take her seriously. They don't see her as being sort of like a lightweight. I mean, she wouldn't be in the final two candidates if they did think that. But I think what's interesting is that, to have kind of a Mars-Neptune conjunction in Cancer, it can be a little bit vague and nebulous. And, it could be in that sense that she helps to bring structure to what it is that they want to achieve, what the party, what the members want. Maybe she can get a kind of clearer idea in terms of listening to their needs and what they actually sort of want as a party. And then sort of be able to kind of to deliver, to sort of create specific mandates and then deliver on those particular things, maybe more so than the Tory party itself. So that's kind of interesting. And then she also has Neptune and the part of fortune conjunct the Tory Jupiter. So that is very, very positive. You can see Jupiter down here in the 4th house in its own sign of Sagittarius. So very, very kind of ebullient, enthusiastic, and what's the word? Like motivated, if you like. Secretly, quite a party that wants people to get ahead, and that wants people to sort of do well. And I think to have Neptune there in Sagittarius, I do think that this speaks to her idealism. I think there is an underlying idealism which you don't see in her sort of current leadership campaign. But if you go back and look at old videos of her when she was, as I say, um, part of the like the Lib Dems and that kind of thing, you can see that more idealistic side of her. And I think that the Tory party, certainly if she was elected, would give her the ability to actually sort of express that more. So I think that we're likely to see that in the future. It's certainly not something that she's kind of getting into now, and I think that's for pragmatic reasons. And then finally, she's got Pluto trine the Tory party Uranus. Now that can sometimes be a little bit explosive. You can see Uranus here also in its own sign of Aquarius in the 6th house, and where is her Pluto? Here in Libra, so in sort of close to the Tory party's 2nd house. And it could be that what it's pointing to here is that there might be a little of a power struggle when it comes to things like money. I mean, obviously that's a big issue at the moment with the economy, and everyone is feeling very uncertain, particularly once we go into the autumn, as to things like, gas and electricity prices for ordinary folk. A lot of people are calling on the government to do more to try and cap the price of energy, and to help people to get through the winter because of the cost of living crisis. So it could be that that's where her mettle is kind of tested, and that she could come to blows with other members of the Tory party, particularly, Rishi, her kind of counterpart in this race, who obviously has experience as having been Chancellor. So it could be that she might come up against some unexpected challenges there. A lot of people have already criticised her for not giving a lot of details about her economic policy, and I think that again, it speaks to what we'll see again when we come to human design. It speaks to the fact that she is kind of moon ruled in a lot of respects, and that she is not necessarily somebody who's going to be able to just sort of give a lot of details, that she has to really sort of work through that emotional wave in order to feel her way through something, and that she is in a sense a little bit changeable, and that has been a critique of some people who've worked with her, who said that she can be a little bit vague. Like she can say, this policy doesn't work for me, or this draft of this particular kind of plan doesn't work for me, but then doesn't give details about what she would like instead. And it could be that she runs into trouble, from that aspect, because people obviously want answers, and they want answers quickly, given that we have got this impending crisis coming, over the autumn and into the winter, for people, that you really want somebody who's got their hand on the tiller. And I suppose the jury's out on whether she'll be able to sort of leap into action and have the wherewithal, the knowledge to be able to sort of steer things kind of competently from an economic perspective. So, I mean, it might be that if she does win, that she needs to get someone on board as a chancellor like Rishi, who does have experience in the role, or the current chancellor, I think Najim, I think is his name, or Nadim. Can't remember his surname now, but also a very competent person. But obviously he's hampered at the moment because he can't really make any policy decisions until they have a new prime minister. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But there is potentially the potential for a little bit of a power struggle there if she's not sort of careful. So that could be a little bit explosive. Something to watch, I think, in the future. But now let's move on to her human design, because this is where things get really, really, really interesting. So if we look at her human design, Liz Truss is actually what we call a 1-3 manifesting generator, but she's of the type that is actually closer to a manifester than a generator. So you get two types of kind of manifesting generator. You get ones that are essentially sort of generators with manifesting abilities, and then you get manifestors with generator abilities, and she technically is what we call a manifestor with generator abilities, so very similar to Elon Musk, somebody who is a manifestor but actually is connected to an energy center, what we call an energy center. So they're not kind of the type of leader who's going to just bark orders and then expect everyone else to carry them out. They are the type of person who are doers themselves, so they will kind of lead from the front. They will sort of like, what's the word, they will lead by example. And so it's interesting that she's actually a very, very powerful individual from a sort of an energetic point of view. And I think people sense that about her. Often they say that, one of the things that manifestors come up against in their life is the sense of people feeling threatened by them, and so they thwart them. They kind of throw obstacles in their path. And in this sense, we could be seeing some of the criticism of her as coming from that place, particularly from men who feel threatened, because there's nothing more threatening than a strong, powerful woman. So that is something to sort of take on board. When we are sort of considering her as an individual, that she does have the 2034 channel switched on by her lunar node. So this is almost kind of, this is the channel associated with power, with charisma, and with deeds designed to maintain survival, and not just for herself, but also for the collective. So, it means that she has the throat, which is the ability to sort of like make decisions and to sort of issue orders, but then she also has the ability to sort of make sure that they are carried out, and will do what she can to carry them out herself. And that is a formidable combination that really is very, very powerful. So, I wouldn't be surprised if we do see strong opposition to her, first of all, to her leadership bid, and of course to, if she does get into the position, that she will always potentially have quite strong enemies, or people that are sort of like envious or jealous of her, and that's kind of stand in her way, and that try to sort of thwart her ability to sort of get things done. So similar to what Obama discovered when he had his first term, and he didn't have the House with him. That was very difficult to sort of to get things done, to do any business. But then what's so interesting, given what I was saying about all the water in her chart, is that she does have emotional authority. So all the human design, every human design kind of body graph has a particular area that represents how they make decisions based. And what's so interesting about all of the centers is that you cannot in human design have either the crown or the third eye as being centers of authority. So in other words, none of us really make decisions using our head. We can kind of process information, we can use it to help us to make decisions, but ultimately all of us make decisions from other places. And in Liz Truss's case, she has emotional authority, so she makes decisions based on her emotions. And if she does have Cancer rising and the moon in Pisces, this makes her very lunar in nature, which is very in keeping with this particular center, because it is moon ruled. It's about waves of emotion. And the one thing that they always kind of say to you in human design is, don't make decisions on the hoof, don't make decisions immediately. Wait for the full, kind of cycle of the emotional wave to sort of to work through the whole cycle before you make a decision, because otherwise what will happen is you might be very enthusiastic about something and agree to it, and then change your mind within a couple of days or hours. So it's important to work through that emotional wave before committing to anything. And then let's move on to Rishi. So Rishi is a completely different sort of kettle of fish, if you like. His kind of manifesto is rebuild the economy, and that's obviously because he is a former chancellor. Keep Brexit safe. So in other words, he is still very much for maintaining Brexit, not trying to reverse it. And the interesting thing is that Liz was originally she voted against Brexit, so she's a Remainer traditionally, and beats Starmer's Labour. So in other words, he's thinking about the next election, and I think, but the poll suggested that he was probably the best candidate to win in the next election in terms of if it came down to him and Liz Truss. So that's sort of interesting. He's playing to his strengths here. And as I say, you can see from this picture that he's quite well. He obviously works out, and is sort of very trim and slim. He did spend time in California, so I think he is sort of aware of the whole kind of health and fitness thing, and I think he's kind of emphasizing that with all the green. And he does have this moniker of of Dishy Rishi, so he is kind of known for being quite sort of good looking and not at all smarmy, but I think he does exude a degree of kind of health and well-being, which I think does appeal to a certain demographic, if you like. I think particularly millennials. So I think that's interesting. So he says, I'm standing to be the leader of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister of our country. Britain's potential is limitless. I'm firmly committed to ensuring our country is the best place to live, work and have a family. I have a proven track record of showing serious leadership in tough situations, saving millions of jobs during the pandemic, providing the largest increase in defence spending since the Cold War, and fully funding the recent Rwanda resettlement programme. Together we can rebuild the economy, keep Britain safe, Brexit safe, and beat Starmer's Labour. So I think he's again trying to sort of appeal to the sort of the middle of the party, but slightly to the right. But also being seen as sort of young and dynamic. I think he is trying to sort of say, Britain's potential is limitless. I want to sort of help young people get ahead. I want to help people get ahead generally. So he's very much about that sort of that ideal of self-improvement and that kind of thing. And he is a living example of that. He came from a sort of a upper middle class family, but he went to a good school, Winchester School in Hampshire, and kind of went on to sort of to go to Oxford and that kind of thing. But he was certainly the first person in his family to do that. So in that sense, I think he is he's an aspirational figure for a lot of Britons, and in that sense, I think he is sort of playing to his strengths. So that's kind of interesting. But let's look at his chart. Now this is, again, I've rectified the chart based on my best guess of what his rising sign is likely to be. And so I've set it for 7 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of May 1980. We don't know his birth time, but this is my best guess. And I'm kind of basing it on, it's a kind of an intuitive sense of his character, but also it's got Venus in the first house. And, he does have this kind of nickname of Dishy Rishi. And I think this fits quite nicely with the idea of somebody who is charming and pleasant and good looking, but not necessarily in a smarmy way. It's quite a sort of a light way, and I think he's got a bit of a he's got a pleasant kind of disposition, and a lot of people like him. The likability score is quite high for Rishi. So I think that this Venus in the first house would fit with his Taurus stuff. You can see he's got a stem of Taurus stuff. The Sun, Mercury, the part of Fortune, and Chiron in the 12th house, and I think that also fits quite well. That the Sun is rising, but the ascendant is still in Gemini, and you do get the sense with Rishi that he is, although he's got Sun Taurus, he doesn't come across as being a sort of like a strongly earthy Taurus. He does come across as being he's got that kind of lightness of touch that I think could be down to sort of a strong Mercury or Gemini rising, something like that. Something to just kind of lighten the load. And then I also like Neptune being across the way on his descendant, because there is something very kind about Rishi, and he does kind of come across as somebody who's very kind of open and enthusiastic, and to me there's something of like the sort of the Labrador puppy about him, and I think that could be this Neptune, which is sort of usually very friendly, very generous, very enthusiastic, and sometimes doesn't have good boundaries. So, but is very service oriented, and so I kind of like that for the ascendant, where you've got the Sun and on one side Mercury on the other. And I think it's important to sort of say that he does natally have a Sun Neptune opposition, or well, I mean it's not really an opposition because Neptune's in Sagittarius and the Sun is still in Taurus, so no, it's not an opposition. It is a quincunx. So it's still a little bit of an uncomfortable aspect, that I do think that one of the things that stops him from shining is the fact that other people may take advantage of his good nature. And so, he's probably had to, over the years, learn to adapt, or to sort of adjust that Neptune, so that he does have better boundaries, so that that he isn't such a sort of a target for people who are, what's the word? Who may not necessarily have the best motives, put it that way. Um, but then, as I say, he does potentially have Venus in the first house, and he does have quite a lot of positive Venus aspects. That Venus is sextile to Mars and Jupiter. He's got a Mars-Jupiter conjunction. You can see down here in Virgo, and he does come across as being, as I say, quite healthy and fit. And that would fit with somebody who's got sort of like Sun Jupiter in Virgo. Virgo is a sign that loves health, and Mars likes to keep fit and to sort of do exercise. And then you've got the Jupiter aspect, which is the sort of the feel-good aspect. So I do think that for Rishi, that there's a strong, one of the things that kind of keeps him on the level, and makes him function very well and handle stress, is probably the fact that he does a lot of exercise. I think you can tell that he does do a lot of exercise. And then, sextile to Venus, I think that again is part of his appeal, that he does have this wholesome, healthy, quite sort of energetic and positive, like upbeat kind of disposition. And I think that probably would appeal a lot to young people. So I'd imagine that within the Conservative Party, there are probably a lot of members that are up and coming that would support him. But of course, the problem with the Conservative Party is that it is generally, the power base still resides with the sort of the pale male, the sort of older pale male. And so in that respect, I don't know whether he's going to sort of get the edge at this point. But I think the key thing with Rishi is to sort of say that he is very ambitious. He's he's also someone who's a hard worker, and anyone who's got a lot of Virgo in their chart, which he does, he's got Saturn in Virgo, and Jupiter as well, and Mars, is going to be a hard worker. This is someone who's really, really good with detail, who doesn't mind rolling up the sleeves and doing the hard graft, who's very modest, and I think that, we can definitely say that about him. But it doesn't mean that he's not ambitious. If you've got a Mars-Jupiter conjunction, you are quite an ambitious person. So I would not underestimate him. But I think he's the type of person that's going to get there, perhaps by kind of hitching his star to somebody else who's maybe a little bit more powerful than him. I suppose in much the same way as he kind of came to prominence through being the Chancellor to Boris, in the sense that he was a good foil to Boris. He never stood on Boris's toes, but he kind of did, he did a really good job of being Chancellor at a time when the country needed somebody really competent, and at the same time was not afraid to take risks and to be a little bit bold, in terms of coming up with the, like the COVID grants and that kind of thing. So I think that's probably his route to power, is not necessarily directly, but similar to kind of, I don't want to compare him to Gordon Brown, because I don't think he's at all like Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown's quite a serious person. But I think Gordon might also be a Taurus, or have strong Taurus in his chart. But in that sense, his Sun in Taurus, I think, is good, because it does make him a good money man. It makes him, he's a steady hand on the tiller, and I think even if he doesn't win the leadership race, I think he could well end up back in the position of Chancellor, and that might be a step up for him. That might be his next step, kind of up to power. But certainly, I think in terms of polling, he did the best, I think, at the beginning of the race, as far as being the best candidate to help the Tories win an election. So it depends on what the Tories are kind of looking for in terms of a candidate. Are they just looking for somebody to sort of fill in until they can find somebody that they feel will win them the next election? Or are they looking more long term? Are they are they looking for somebody that they think will kind of go the distance, type of thing? I think that's the big question. But definitely, if you've got Mars-Jupiter conjunction, you are very dynamic. And as I say, this is someone who's really, really good with detail. You definitely want someone like Rishi on your team, because he's not going to let you down. He's not going to drop the ball. He's going to stay on message. And he's also going to be very sharp. He's going to come up with some really interesting facts and details that maybe other people might miss. So in that sense, I think he's very diligent and definitely a sort of a doer. And then he's also got Moon in Aries, which, again, some people might find surprising because Moon in Aries does tend to be, someone who's quite passionate. And, he doesn't kind of come across that way. But then, that Moon is also trying to Neptune. So that can sort of, I think, dampen down any potential selfishness, because Moon in Aries can be a little bit sort of me. So I think that, again, that Neptune helping to kind of soften any edges. And, if he did have a temper when he was younger, I think that the Neptune would have helped him to sort of build up like tolerance and sort of like empathy for people around him, so that it would become more good natured. It would sort of dilute that energy a little bit, because Moon in Aries can be, as I say, a little bit not volatile. Although I think it is important to point out that he does have his Sun and Mercury opposite Uranus. So this is not somebody that one should underestimate. Uranus in Scorpio is quite it's that surprise sting in the tail, and the sting in the tail that can come out of nowhere. And just to kind of have that opposite his Sun Mercury, I think, he probably is very good natured and tolerant and sort of easygoing most of the time. But I think if you push his buttons too far and he snaps, I think people can probably be quite shocked at his kind of reaction. So I'd be interested to see Rishi under stress. That might be a tell, for how that Uranus kind of works, because if the houses are correct, then it would put Uranus in his 6th house, and obviously that's the house of work and the house of health. So if he's under stress on some level, like whether he's either ill or working too hard, it's possible that Uranus might show itself. And also I think the other thing to bear in mind is that that Uranus would also rule his midheaven, and so I think, again, people underestimate him at their peril, and I think it's something that we'll see when we look at his human design, that it's also kind of built into his human design as far as his leadership abilities and things are concerned. I think this is someone who ultimately is going to take a lot of people by surprise long term. I don't know whether he's going to win this particular race, but I don't necessarily think that. I think it's sort of a case of the hare and the tortoise. That even if he doesn't win this particular race, that I think long term he's someone to watch out for, to look out for, to sort of to keep your eye on. So here we move to the bi-wheel, and again we've got the Tory party chart in this sort of the inner chart, and then we've got his chart transposed on that. And again, there's a lot of synastry here. It's quite interesting. Both candidates have a lot of synastry with this 1912 chart. So the first thing, of course, that we notice is that he's got Jupiter and Mars rising in Virgo, and this is conjunct the Tory party ascendant. So this is very, very promising. I think that definitely he's a doer, he's a go-getter, and I think his enthusiasm and his general sort of like joie de vivre and kind of he exudes so much positive energy that I think this will definitely appeal to the Tory party. They like the fact that he's someone who likes to get ahead, who's aspirational, who wants to sort of do well for himself, and this is kind of espousing the more sort of like the aspirational side of the Tory party, if you like. He also has his nodes across the ascendant-descendant axis of the Tory chart, so that again is quite significant. It does point to the Tory party as being a great catalyst for him. It's that the two entities are kind of destined to sort of like play an important role in history together, that through the Tory party he could really make a name for himself. And it's interesting that he's got the North Node in Leo, so it may be part of his sort of his life lesson, or the reason that he's here, is to learn to sort of like shine his light brightly and not apologize for being successful, or that kind of thing. And he has had a lot of detractors that have tried to sort of like pull him down and sort of like brief against him and that kind of thing. So it's possible that this is part of his soul lesson for this particular lifetime. But I think it's really interesting, as I say, that he does have this really interesting synastry with the Tory chart. The other thing is that he's got his Sun Mercury conjunct the Sun Saturn conjunction here on the midheaven. Again, very, very positive. Sun on the midheaven usually points to a leader in the ascendancy, somebody who's got a bright future, somebody who is a natural leader, and to have that kind of synastry with this Tory Sun Saturn conjunction, I think points to the fact that the leadership certainly have plans for him, long term, that they think that he's definitely someone that can take them far, that can take the party far. It just may not necessarily be that his time is now. I think that's the key thing, is whether the timing is 100% right. And then the other thing that is interesting is that his moon is conjunct the north node of the Tory party chart. So again, interesting, that Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak have this this affiliation, this kind of synastry with the Tory north node. So again, both obviously playing an important role in the destiny of the party. And to have the moon here, I think, is interesting. It does point to some element of the feminine aspect somehow being involved. Whether this is him supporting Liz Truss, because I think that he is a candidate, or he's a politician that would work really well with women. I don't see him as being somebody who's going to be sexist or sort of stuck up or refuse to sort of work with women. I think he's quite modern in that sense, and this could be where he could really help the Tory party to sort of improve their diversity, in especially since we've had so many resignations of women MPs in recent years due to a lot of harassment and like hate from from trolls and that kind of thing. So that's an interesting one. It would be interesting to see if he did get into power, how many women would be in his cabinet. I would think, the number would be quite high. So that's kind of interesting. And then he also has some harmonious aspect patterns in terms of his Saturn. It's in a minor grand trine with the Tory Mars and Sun Saturn conjunction. So, we've got the Sun Saturn here, and then we've got where's the Tory Mars here with Neptune. So I think it's interesting that he's got a lot of positive aspect patterns, in relation to the Tory party chart, more so than Liz does. She's got quite a lot of squares and that kind of thing if you look at the overall kind of aspect patterns. So I think, he would have an easy ride to the top, but then he is a male and he is good with sort of figures and the economy and that kind of thing. And that's always a kind of a winning combination for the Tory party, because they are seen as the party of people who kind of keep a handle on the budget, don't let things, don't spend too much, etc., etc. Although, I mean, under Boris Johnson, I think the national debt went up considerably. I think it was a very large percentage of GDP that got spent on grants, but then that was exceptional circumstances. So, I don't think that, he has said a number of times that we have to be realistic in terms of the budget and that we do need to try and balance the books. But of course, it's all about, extraordinary times require extraordinary measures, and sometimes you have to sort of like push the boat out a little bit. And I think, that's why he kind of did what he did. I mean, I think it's interesting too that he's got Pluto on the south node of the Tory party. So, and this is in the third house. So Saturn in the second, which is a great, as I say, for balancing the books and for being a good treasurer, that kind of thing. I think he's definitely seen as a steady hand on the tiller, and that might be exactly what the UK needs right now, given the cost of living crisis and the fact that things are expected to get really much worse for people in the autumn and the winter with inflation, especially with energy prices. So it may be that Conservative members decide to vote for him, in that respect, especially given that, Liz Truss she's not being really big on detail when it comes to her economic policy, whereas he's a kind of a tried and tested, a known entity when it comes to, the Treasury. So that's an interesting one. I mean, it might also be that they decide that he would be a better treasurer, that he would be better going back into the position of Chancellor. So that could kind of go either way for him, I think. But as I say, going back to this Pluto on the South Node, I do think that that this is potentially problematic. I think that this is where he's a little bit weak, is in terms of like communication. That a lot of people feel that he doesn't have a lot of charisma, and he's sort of lacking that sort of gravitas at the moment that I think is required for the role of Prime Minister. Although, I mean, I think after Boris it's hard not to seem like you have some gravitas. But I think if you compare him to Liz, she does seem to be a little bit more serious, and she has had more experience in senior posts in government. So, that might count against Rishi in this particular instance. So, and it could also be, as I say, that this is people. It could be backbiting. It could be, as I say, people counter briefing against him, that kind of thing. Because Pluto can sometimes attract scheming and people sort of trying to undermine you, that sort of thing. So yeah, it's an interesting one. And then he also has his Neptune is also trying to the Tory party Mercury North Node combination, so that again is very positive, and I do see that Neptune is actually ultimately working in his favour, that Neptune on the descendant that he's got, that he is seen as someone who really wants to sort of like serve and kind of and is quite selfless in terms of his dedication to the job, and I think that would really count in his favour, with the Tories, in terms of work ethic and that kind of thing. And I think it's also interesting that the nodal axes in both instances are in harmony. So again, there's this sense of destiny when it comes to Rishi and the Tory party, that I do think that they have a long relationship ahead of them. And as I say, even if he doesn't make it into the final vote this time, I don't think we should sort of rule him out as being a Prime Minister in the future. That's kind of my feeling. But let's move on to his human design, because that's where I think things get really interesting. So here is Rishi's human design body graph, and what's interesting about him is that he's a 3-6 generator, but he does have a lot of centers switched on, including his will center and his throat center. So that's kind of unusual for a generator, because generators usually have the sacral center switched on, but they don't always have access to the throat. And I think it's interesting that he is split definition in the sense that he's got the third eye and the throat connected, but it is not then connected up to other parts of his chart. So it's almost like these two parts to him. The one part that is very brainy and is a good problem solver and is quite sort of cerebral on the one hand, and then there's the part of him that I think is quite soft and emotional and is kind of full of health on the other. And I think in terms of the two things, that it makes him a good package, but somehow the two things don't kind of join up. And I think being a generator, if you say compare power in terms of power and charisma, that Liz Truss certainly wins out in terms of who's more powerful of the two people. But as I say, we should not underestimate him, because he does have the will center switched on. And what's so fascinating is that it's switched on via the 2551. And 51, hexagram 51, is the hexagram known as shock. And remember what I was saying about that Uranus in Scorpio that he's got. That, he's not somebody to be underestimated. That I really do think he could take a lot of people by surprise. And that ultimately, the fact that he's got that will center switched on, I think, points to the fact that he will end up in leadership positions long term. It just might not necessarily be it won't be in the sort of traditional way of like smiting your enemies and being very sort of alpha male, put it that way. I think this is Rishi is somebody who to me represents the sort of the more like the new male, in that I think he's probably very good, that he gets on very well with women. He's not threatened by women, that he doesn't have a huge ego, and ultimately, as I say, I do feel with him that he wants to make a difference, and that he wants to sort of be of service. And I think that ultimately it's those kind of values that are going to win out long term with the younger generation of voters. So I do think he has a very bright future ahead of him. Now, he does, and the other thing, of course, is that he's got the moon in gate 51. So again, that feminine energy that I was talking about, with his Aries moon making a conjunction to the Tory party North Node, but also, in his own chart trining to Neptune. So I do think that there's a kind of a softness about him, but again, not somebody to be underestimated. And I think will win out through kind of soft power, or just sort of one of those people who wins through hard work and likability rather than being a sort of a gangster, if you like. And, I also feel with him that there's a sort of a youthfulness about him, and I think that might be attributed to the fact that he is a 3-6 generator. So 3-6s, generally speaking, have kind of 3 phases in their lives. So they start off experimenting and sort of like trying things and then failing, and I think you can see that in terms of his career. He started out doing all the right things. He as I say, he went to a good school, he went on to Oxford University, he then went to a job in the city, and then he moved to California to sort of manage a number of hedge funds. But he made some mistakes along the way. There's that whole thing about him having a green card, and him having a green card, and his wife being a non-dom, and kind of innocent mistakes that I don't think that he thought will kind of count against him. He didn't do anything illegal, but it certainly was frowned upon by certain kind of members of the establishment. And so in that sense, and again, him sort of being in the city and stuff until I think he went into politics when he was about 35 or 37, something like that. So it kind of fits with this idea that the 3-6 experiments up to the age of 28, then from 28 until around about 50 or so, they tend to then learn from others, to sort of sit back and sort of learn from the mistakes of others. So they first kind of knock their heads and make mistakes themselves, then they learn from the mistakes of others by kind of observing, being around people maybe who make gaffes and that kind of thing. And then normally when they get to around about age 50 or so, they move into their 6 energy, which is about coming off the roof, as it's known in human design. So this is when you become a role model or a leader. So as I say, I do think that with Rishi, he's got to play the long game. I think for him it's going to be a case potentially of being the tortoise, not the hare, and that he might have to sort of gradually work his way up by being in supportive roles to other people who are in positions of power, being a foil to other people. And that, whether it's by the time he gets to his Chiron return at around about age 50, this is when he could really potentially come into his own. So I think, it's kind of a long game for him. But as I say, it's interesting that he has both the throat and the will senses activated, and that he can lead through sort of oratory with the 2551. This particular channel is interestingly associated with innocence and unconditional love. So as I say, there is something very innocent about him. There is something to me of the kind of puppy about him in terms of his looks, and his kind of, there's something very open about him. But also, as I say, that this 2551 is associated with shock. So I think, people will probably think that he's a bit of a pushover with all that kind of niceness, that sort of Venus in Gemini energy, only to find that he is actually very competitive, and that they shouldn't sort of underestimate him. It could also be, of course, that that other women are competitive with him, and that he does have this slightly strange dynamic with women that want to kind of try and dominate him. So that's something that I think we need to kind of watch. Particularly if, for example, Liz does get in and she sort of appoints him to her cabinet. It'd be interesting to see how that kind of relationship works. And then, interestingly, like Liz, he's also got emotional authority. So wisdom, again, for him, coming through, cycling through the entire emotional wave before acting. So this is, again, someone who shouldn't make rush decisions, who needs to really sort of sleep on things and wait for the emotional wave to break before they commit to anything. And someone who's quite heart-led, which I think we do see with that strong Neptune and the moon Neptune's trine. So I think that fits quite nicely, that this is someone who's got a lot of empathy and compassion for other people, and again, I think, has gone into politics for those kind of humanitarian reasons, if you like. But then on the other side, he does have this 2343 channel, which connects the throat up to the third eye, the Ajna center. And this is known as the channel of structuring. So it's very cerebral. This is someone who's very logical and who is good at connecting logic with the throat. So in other words, they can work through or understand concepts, and they can then explain them to others in a very sort of simple and clear way. And I think this is probably where he's really, really good, is that he can take sort of like technical information, break it down for people very easily, and can sort of number crunch no problem. And I would imagine probably did really well at school and university. But I think sometimes the key thing with this particular combination is that these are people who must wait to be asked for information. So they're very often the sort of the brain boxes who kind of work behind the scenes, do all the number crunching, but then they need to be in that meeting and then wait for the boss to address them before they speak. That's how the energy tends to work. This throat center is not connected up to the will center, so he doesn't have to be invited to speak or give his opinion. And I think that is essentially the problem in terms of the energetic dynamics that sort of stop him from having that charisma, that stop him from being able to kind of blaze a trail or sort of to initiate, to make changes. He needs to sort of be asked, and in that sense tends to play a supporting role. So yes, that's my overall assessment, I think, then, of the two people is that, of the two characters, particularly when you look at the human design, I think that Liz Truss looks like the much stronger candidate, and so I'm inclined to think that, in terms of the vote, that leadership is more than likely going to go to Liz Truss, and she is currently the favourite. So, but as I say, I don't think we should underestimate Rishi. I do think he's got a bright future ahead of him, and that he just needs to sort of play the long game. So yeah, I hope you found that interesting. Of course, it'll be fascinating to see what happens on the 5th. But if you are interested in looking at some of my previous political blogs, do check out my Astroinsights blog, which you can find at blog.astrologysphere.com.